and welcome to the Diving Deeper podcast, where we dive into real topics and have real conversations about theories and topics that we need to discuss. I'm Sydney Wicker.
And I'm Schiller. Today we are breaking down critical race theory, what it is, why it's so controversial, and how can it be taught in school today. We break it all down right here and right now.
Alrighty, Katie, let's go ahead and start breaking down critical race theory and what it is exactly. Now, I understand it can be pretty confusing for people who aren't really familiar with critical race theory to understand what it is. So I'm just going to break it down here really simple. I know it's difficult to understand, like I said, but it's important to note that critical race theory is not something new. In fact, it's been around since the 1970s, and it's a framework that was developed in order to examine how policies could perpetuate systemic racism through the history of racism in our country and to better understand and to explain these concepts. So like I mentioned, in the 1970s, a group of lawyers, activists, and legal scholars all came together to help create what we know as CRT, critical race theory. And due to the realization that the civil rights movement had in the 1960s, this helped push the success and the start of critical race theory. Now, it also grew from radical feminist movements, Black Power movements, and legal studies movements as well. Katie, I'm going to toss it over to you so you can help explain it. How would you describe critical race theory?
Yeah, so it was created to describe the intersections of race, power, and the legal system in America, as well as how the current system functions to further racism and white supremacy. A big foundational piece was legal intermediacy, which means that not every case has one right outcome. So different identities and different circumstances might see how a quote unquote right outcome is different for everyone.
Absolutely. And one thing we talk about is the tenet of critical race theory. So, racism is this like normal white over colored slaves, many purposes, dominant groups, intersectionality. This all comes into critical race theory and how it is as a social construct. Katie, is there anything else that you want to add on it as a social construct?
I think the founders just really found it was important to talk about differential racialization. So one of the best examples that I felt like helped me understand it was at certain times in American history, immigrant farm workers have been really important for our country, and at other times they haven't been. So when they are really important, that's typically when our country seems to look at immigrants or brown folks in a better light. And then at other times they'll be looked at differently. And the founders also thought it was super important to recognize that people of color have really unique voices that we need to include in our conversations because they can bring forth different ideas and thoughts that we haven't considered ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so crazy how much we just have even learned about critical race theory from our class, but just knowing that it's more than just this topic. There's ways that people need to learn how to integrate it into schools, which is a topic that we're going to talk about, how it needs to be a bigger discussion, but yet it's kind of something somewhat new. Like we haven't really talked about this a lot before. So it's really interesting to me, just I think learning overall about how big this topic is, yet how little it's been talked about.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if some FBI agent on my phone is listening or something, but ever since we've started talking about this podcast, I've had so many different news articles and TikToks and social media pages talking about critical race theory. And I think the fact that so many folks in our class felt the need to use it as a project really to show how important it is and how shocked we all are that it's really just not talked about in our current educational system.
You are so right, Katie, in the way that it's affected our school systems, man. It has affected them a lot. And we'll go ahead and dive into that a little bit more. But coming up next, we're going to talk about why critical race theory is so controversial. So we'll be right back after this quick break. right, Katie, I know we kind of teased a little bit. We're going to talk about why it's so controversial, this critical race theory topic. Why don't you go ahead and kick us off first? Why is it so controversial?
Well, it's definitely been controversial for decades because it definitely does talk about intersections of power and race and how America is inherently racist, which is a really hot button for folks. But during the Trump presidency, he actually released an executive order on combating race and sex stereotypes. And in Section 1, he basically made it illegal for the federal workplaces to include diversity training that's foundational teachings was in critical race theory. And I did pull one paragraph from the order that I thought was super important to share today. And it is today, however, many people are pushing a different vision of America that is grounded in hierarchies based on collective social and political identities rather than in the inherent and equal dignity of every person as an individual. This ideology is rooted in the pernicious and false belief that America is an irredeemably racist and sexist country, that some people, simply on account of their race or sex, are oppressors, and that racial and sexual identities are more important than our common status as human beings in America. Um, so, yeah, that was what was in his executive order that outlawed CRT and many federal buildings and teachings. But now we're going to take a break and listen to a little clip that we found online that helps one to understand critical race theory and how an intersection of grace and respect can work really well with one another with understanding this topic.
So critical grace theory, this idea that
critical
grace theory is the first article I wrote, and it came out of this idea of common grace and the reality that we do this in every other sphere of discipline, right? You know, we look at, something like, we use the word narcissist all the time. Well, that's a word that Sigmund Freud created, and he's the father of psychoanalysis, who was a rabid atheist, but yet somehow we find value in some of the insights that he had about psychoanalysis. You turn over to postmodern theory and other things as well, and so I'm like, we have this aspect of common grace in our toolkit to be able to embrace this. Why is this such a big deal? So then after I did a podcast and kind of a debate with Dr. Neil Shinvey about this, and I started to engage in just hearing the different things, I realized something. That part of the issue is not critical race theory at all. It's the fact that people have an uncritical race theory. They have a theory, a perspective on race that is uncritical. They just assume that race exists just as commonly as gender, just as commonly as my economic class, without any historical baggage. And because of that, anything that therefore critiques the racial caste system that we have must be critical race theory. And so what ends up happening is this one label of this one particular discipline that's a very obscure academic perspective that started in legal studies and now is kind of picked up steam in different places and in the academy, is being wrongly attributed to anyone who has anything to say about justice. Now, are there some overlaps there? Of course. Are there some things? But it's really the wrong question, in my estimation, of, well, what is it and how do we unpack it? But it's, and also because it's such a broad definition that many people don't even have the same perspective.
Man, Katie, after listening to that, just such powerful words right there, hearing how the perspective of critical race theory is really so different. One place we really see this is in the school system. You had mentioned before you'd seen a lot of TikToks where a lot of parents and different kids, they're being taught almost to feel guilt, and they don't want, that's their biggest problem with it. They feel like their kids are going to be guilty because they're too white, and there's nothing that they can do, that they were born white, and that's just the way it is. But I feel like what his message is saying is just understanding critical race theory and the importance of it. It has been villainized for so long, and Trump's presidency really didn't help with that very much. We got that little excerpt that you shared with us from his executive order. It's clear that this is a deep-rooted problem. And it's been going on for so long. And I don't think a lot of people have realized exactly how long critical race theory has been a topic.
I agree. Yeah, I personally didn't even know any history on CRT until I got to college. And I feel like if I would have started learning it from a younger age, I would have not only had an easier time understanding it and all of its tenets and how it really works in our modern day society, but it would have helped me build a better anti-racist framework from an earlier age.
Yeah.
And we're seeing, you know, as you said, it's in the schools, and I think it's become a really hot topic right now as we're transitioning out of the Trump presidency and we're transitioning into a different presidency that has these promises of new hopes and um, kind of working to eradicate racism in America. And we're just seeing certain schools push back against it and some really accept it.
Yeah, absolutely. And even just looking at the school systems overall, Tennessee has banned critical race theory from being in public schools. Idaho, Missouri, Texas, and many other states are looking to do the same because it teaches that people are inherently racist for just being white because that's who they are. Do you think that these schools should be able to ban critical race theory from being taught in school?
I think that's a really hard question. I think especially since they're public schools, um, public public schools are an interesting place to be.
Yeah,
I went to public schools. I
so
don't
did
know.
I.
Yeah. And I'm realizing all of the issues that are kind of in public schools. Personally, I don't think CRT should be excluded. I don't think there should be legal findings keeping it excluded. I feel like if they really looked into it, that would kind of be anti-American, not allowing folks
Yeah.
to learn and not allowing them to learn things that can make themselves and our country better. Um, yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to agree with you. It doesn't seem like you can just ban a certain part of education from kids. I didn't know about critical race theory till I came to college. Neither did you. So this is a big deal and it's a big topic because we're learning all this information in one semester when we could be learning it throughout an entire school year. So I think it's really important to understand critical race theory, but also to understand the importance of its teachings because it's two different things, and it's not like if we hold this back, if we're just going to not teach kids about it, they're going to learn about it at some point. Why not start it sooner? Give them a chance to learn, like, hey, you are white. That does come with a certain privilege. But we need to address here that there's more to it than just that. And you're not supposed to feel guilty about it, but if you can be a voice and you can be an advocate, there's so much more you can do with it. So I feel like it could be so powerful, especially for younger kids. But it also comes down to the right teachers and the right people who want to listen. There's some people in their homes who they're being told one thing and one way is the only way, and that's not always right. So I think it's a really big topic, but it's something that's got to be covered and it's something that needs to be learned about. But in these school systems, we're starting to see more of this tackle between the back and forth. What do teachers do? Is this something that they should allow? Is it not? So we're going to break down how it should be integrated into the school systems in just a minute. All right, coming back now. As me and Katie had mentioned before, we both went to public schools. We both think critical race theory is something that we should have been taught at an earlier age. But Katie, I want to start off by asking you, what do you think is the biggest fear people have about integrating critical race theory into the school systems?
Well, I think definitely in our previous conversation where we talked about the white guilt, I think that's a really big fear that folks are going to have, that their white students are going to be taught that they should be ashamed, or something along those lines. So I think we're really going to have to balance we're unfortunately going to have to bring it in a way that kind of leads white folks into it very gently and doesn't make them feel quote unquote like triggered. And we're going to have to use rhetoric that kind of disguises what critical race theory at the beginning, I believe, because CRT, that it's just been so villainized, especially its name, that I think if we try to bring anything in with CRT just in big bold letters all over it, it's just automatically going to get such a large reaction from folks that isn't going to be favorable or welcoming.
Katie, I totally agree with you here. There's a lot to break down as we kind of talk about how it should be integrated into schools. But I want to start by showing a little bit of an example before we go ahead and get more into this debate. So I'm going to play a clip from KGW8 News. They are a news station in Portland, Oregon. And Dan Haggerty, he's the anchor, and he goes ahead and he starts by explaining a little bit of where this anger comes from. And then he tosses it over to Randy Blazak. He's the chairman of Coalition Against Hate Crimes. And he kind of talks about this concept more and explains critical race theory on a broader spectrum, but in a very specific way. So I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to him. We'll hear a little bit of that clip and then we'll come back and finish talking about critical race theory.
Critical race theory has become a rallying point for some conservatives, a sort of cultural war across America. Today in Oklahoma, the Republican-controlled House voted that teachers there won't be allowed to teach certain concepts dealing with race and racism. In Missouri, lawmakers are pushing to ban it, saying it can make children feel bad about being white. But it's important to note that critical race theory isn't a set curriculum given to schools. It's a framework, a way of looking at issues.
There is this lack of understanding about what it means to teach about race, and a very clear example of what we would call white fragility among white people who are very defensive that we dare take on these issues, including in the classroom. And that's the argument is that's the best place to take it on. You know, let's talk about how Columbus did not discover America. There were already people in those places that didn't need to be discovered. Or let's talk about how, you know, we conquered the West, and a lot of that was through genocidal violence against Native people. Or let's talk about how racism didn't end the day that slavery was abolished. You know, we have to have those conversations, and there is a lot of pushback among people. And these are white people who would never consider themselves to be white supremacists, but who really feel like their way of looking at the world is being turned upside down.
I think the root of this problem is that so many people just don't understand critical race theory. There's just this big misconception of not knowing and not understanding. So for there to be a universal curriculum where critical race theory can be taught at its best and can be understood in an easy way, but you're right, there's going to have to be almost like this training of how do you talk to these kids who've only known what they've known their whole lives, and now you're going to kind of have to give them this wake-up call like, hey, you are privileged, but here's why. Here's our history. How can we learn from it? How can we grow from it? How can we be better people because of it? And so I feel like it's starting to include a lot of those like race tensions that you kind of mentioned, those triggers. How do we make sure that people are like going to be okay with this conversation, you know? And I think a lot of people aren't going to be okay, but getting uncomfortable is what's going to make this conversation more comfortable. You got to start getting uncomfortable. You got to start feeling these things. You got to know, you got to learn, but it has to start somewhere.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like when we're creating, I think the universal curriculum is a really great idea, especially it has been so villainized and so many folks have so many different perspectives and understandings of it, that if we don't have one version that we can get everyone to kind of be okay with at the beginning, I think we could get in a lot of trouble. So I think it feels really important to ensure that people of color's voices are included in the dominant voice in creating that curriculum. And, you know, CRT was not created that long ago. Many founding members are still alive today. I actually got the privilege of seeing Kimberlee Crenshaw talk once. And I'm sure if anybody went up to her and was like, could you please help us? Because we should have listened a long time ago and we didn't. And it certainly is not their job to educate all of us. But I think knowing that these folks are still alive today, that's a really incredible resource to maybe reach out and use in making this curriculum.
Katie, I love what you were saying right now, but I want to take a step back because you said that you met Kimberlee Crenshaw. What? That is so crazy. I want you to elaborate on this experience of meeting her. And before I do that, I'm just going to explain for anybody listening who may not know who she is. She's an American lawyer who's a civil rights advocate and philosopher and a leading scholar in critical race theory. And she also helped develop this theory of intersectionality, which is a huge thing kind of a new theory, but it's a huge topic that a lot of people are talking about and diving deeper into. So, Katie, I want to hear about this experience. Go ahead and elaborate. What was it like meeting her?
So I met Kimberlee Crenshaw about 2 or 3 years ago, here at CSU actually.
Mm-hmm.
And I was a little freshman, and I had just learned about her in my class. I just learned what intersectionality was. I was taking this really amazing class with Dr. Caridad Souza. And I just found out that I don't know if you've read How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, but he talks about this teacher that he had who really changed his perspective on race in America. And he was talking about how she takes her students to Kenya, and she grew up in the Bronx. And I was like, that sounds like my Dr. Souza. And so I texted her, and she was like, yeah, it's me. And I think that's so cool that right here in our own community, we have such these intersections and connections to all of these people making change. In America, with eradicating racism and really working towards an anti-racist society, that there's so many voices just in our daily lives that can help us with understanding CRT and creating however we should introduce it in our schools. But when I saw her, she talked about intersectionality, which is a big part of CRT. And when I saw her the first time, I still didn't know what CRT was. I didn't know. And if I would have known, I just feel like that experience would have been so different. But she was so humble. She was like, I'm just going to talk about one of my great accomplishments that I've given to society, which is intersectionality, instead of all of them. But it was really great. It was definitely a highlight of my college experience.
Oh my gosh, I couldn't even imagine. That is just so, so cool. What would you say is the one big takeaway you had from learning from her that you think everybody could benefit from?
I feel like intersectionality. I mean, and I think that's something that a lot of folks are really starting to understand. But I think we're still learning more and more about it today, of how so many different identities, like not just race, gender, sexuality, like race, gender, sexuality, your financial status, like your educational status, if you have health insurance, like there's so many different intersections that come together, and they all, I think that's probably the biggest takeaway that I could see. Maybe that's our foundational piece for our CRT curriculum, is intersectionality.
Yes, no, that is so amazing. I'm so jealous you got to meet with her and you got that experience. But wow, if you did know more about critical race theory, how different do you think your conversation would have been?
I think if I would have known about critical race theory, I probably would have been able to look at it more in a practical lens, because when she was talking about intersectionality, I just kind of looked at it on a personal level of like, how can I practice looking at things through an intersectional lens. And if I would have known about CRT, I think I would have been able to hear her talk and looked at her findings in more of a systemic, structural way of how not only can I look at things intersectionally, but like, how do we have to change all of our systems to really work with so many differing identities and how they all intersect.
Wow, that is just so amazing. I'm sure so many of our listeners are even like, "Wow, this is so amazing, Katie." So that is so cool you got that experience and you got to learn from that. But just like you saying, if you wouldn't have known about critical race theory at that point, it would have even changed one conversation you had. How much more could critical race theory have really like helped change some conversations in your life? It's crazy, but it's true. It really can have such a big impact. And you mentioned intersectionality. You know, that can be a component in critical race theory. Once we start learning these things and we start opening our eyes to this idea that there's so much more out there, it just, oh my gosh, I feel like it's just life changing. I literally always say all the time, I am a different person now than when I first started college, because I've just learned so much and I've grown so much. I give a lot of my credit to Dr. Bimper. I don't know if you've ever had any classes with him. He was the best teacher I've ever had. The way he teaches is in a way that opens your eyes, but it doesn't change your like opinions. So it's objective, but it's like immersive because you're learning so fast and so quick. And I give so much credit to the like teachers that I've had, because my eyes have been opened to so much since I've come to school. But as we start to kind of round out this podcast, what are your final thoughts about critical race theory? Anything you want to end on with a bang right here?
I just feel like, we're in the transition between presidencies, but I think our society is really in a big transition after last summer with having the murder of George Floyd really wake up a lot of Americans. And I think there's lots of talks right now about how the Chauvin verdict, that is not justice, that's accountability. And I really think if we start teaching folks from a very young age about critical race theory, and eventually start introducing more education that's kind of been hidden from folks, that it could really allow us to transition from the kind of quote new era of Jim Crow laws, and help us better understand the Black Lives Matter movement, and so many different racialized aspects of our society so that we can begin working towards an anti-racist, equitable place for folks to be in.
Absolutely. George Floyd, as sad as his death is, he changed the world. I feel like he woke up so many people. He's really shaken up so many things, and it's given us even this platform today to sit here and talk about a controversial topic that really all it is just an educational value. It's something that we need to learn. And I love what you mentioned right there, just about how important it is to understand and to know. And I think it really did start with George Floyd. And there's actually a poem that I want to talk about from the inauguration speech. Amanda Gordon, she gave a speech, and in the last of her lines, she said, "We will rebuild, reconcile, and recover. And every known nook of our nation and every corner called our country, our people
diverse and beautiful will emerge battered and beautiful. When day comes, we step out of the shade, aflame and unafraid. The new dawn blooms as we free it. For there is always light if only we're brave enough to see it, if only we're brave enough to be it."
And I love that poem so much. I feel like it just spoke to so many people. It really spoke to me, and I just feel like that's really all it is. You got to open your eyes. You got to see it. You got to see what's out there. So as we wrap up this episode of Diving Deeper, we just want to say thank you for listening and for being a part of our discussion on critical race theory. Once again, I'm Sydney Wicker.
And I'm Katie Schiller, and we hope you take the time today to critically think about critical race theory and how introducing it to our school systems could really improve our country.